There is a moment, somewhere deep in the 1st century before the Common Era, when the entire ancient world held its breath. 2 fleets, one belonging to the greatest empire the Western world had ever seen, and one belonging to the last true pharaoh of Egypt, faced each other across a grey and windless stretch of the Ionian Sea. The water was the colour of iron. The ships were enormous, their hulls black with pitch, their oars hanging motionless, waiting. And somewhere in the middle of that fleet, aboard a flagship draped in purple and gold, sat a woman who had once been the most powerful ruler on earth, watching everything she had built teetering at the edge of ruin. Her name, of course, was Cleopatra. But what almost no one today remembers, what history chose to bury beneath centuries of myth about her beauty and her lovers, was that she was also an admiral. She was a naval strategist. She financed, equipped, and personally commanded a fleet of warships that represented the last gasp of Egyptian naval power, and she sailed those ships into the most consequential battle of the ancient world, the Battle of Actium, September 2nd, 31 BC. Tonight, we're going to follow those ships. We're going to walk the ancient dockyards of Alexandria, smell the cedar and pine resin of warships being built, hear the rhythm of oar masters keeping time in the dark water, and stand on the decks as 2 civilizations crashed into one another. We're going to talk about what those ships were, where they came from, who built them, who crewed them, and what happened to every last one of them. We're going to follow the fleet from its assembly to its burning, from its greatest ambitions to its final quiet surrender beneath the Egyptian sun. This is a story about power and the sea, about a woman who refused until the very last possible moment to accept that she had lost, and about the strange, melancholy fate of the ships she left behind, some of them swallowed by the Mediterranean, some of them burned by enemies, some of them found, centuries later, buried in silt at the bottom of the harbour that Cleopatra herself once sailed from. Before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of the internet where history and curiosity meet, and thank you for being here. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. I know someone out there is lying in the dark right now, half asleep on the couch with this playing softly in the background, too tired to get up and go to bed properly. This one is for you. Settle in. We're going a long way back tonight. To understand Cleopatra's navy, you first have to understand the city that built it. And to understand the city, you have to understand what it meant for a place to exist at the exact intersection of the ancient world's greatest powers, its greatest trade routes, and its greatest ambitions all at once: Alexandria. The name alone carries a kind of gravity. It was founded in 331 BC by Alexander the Great, who reportedly walked the shoreline himself and sketched the city's layout in the sand. Or so the story goes, though we should always treat that kind of legend with the affectionate skepticism it deserves. What is certain is that Alexander chose the location with military genius. It sat on a narrow strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea to the north and Lake Mareotis to the south, which meant it had 2 harbours, one facing the sea for trade and naval operations, and one facing the lake for the inland routes that connected Egypt's interior to the wider world. From the moment of its founding, Alexandria was designed to be a place that moved things: goods, ideas, armies, and ships. By the time Cleopatra was born, somewhere around 69 BC, Alexandria had grown into perhaps the largest city in the world outside of Rome. Its population numbered somewhere between 500,000 and a million people, an extraordinary figure for the ancient world, and it drew that population from everywhere: Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Syrians, Nubians, Romans, Persians, and traders from as far away as India and Arabia. The streets smelled of fish sauce, frankincense, and the particular sharp scent of papyrus being processed in the workshops near the harbour. The harbour itself was one of the wonders of the ancient world, not the lighthouse, though that was certainly among the wonders too, but the harbour as a whole, as a system, as a living, breathing machine for the movement of wealth. The great harbour of Alexandria was sheltered by a long artificial mole called the Heptastadion, a causeway 7 stades long, roughly 1,400 metres, that connected the mainland to the island of Pharos, where the great lighthouse stood. This causeway divided the harbour into 2 sections: the great harbour to the east, which was the royal and military harbour, and the Eunostos, the harbour of safe return, to the west, which was the commercial harbour. Ships moved in and out in a constant regulated stream: grain ships from the Nile Delta, merchant vessels from Cyprus and Crete, naval galleys on patrol, royal barges, enormous and gilded, that could barely squeeze through the narrower channels. The lighthouse itself deserves a moment's pause, because it tells you something important about how Alexandria thought about the sea. It stood somewhere between 100 and 140 metres tall. Ancient sources give varying figures, and we will never know the exact height, because the lighthouse was destroyed in a series of earthquakes between the 10th and 14th centuries AD. But even the conservative estimates put it among the tallest structures in the ancient world, visible from perhaps 50 kilometres out to sea. It had a fire burning at its top, reflected and amplified by polished bronze mirrors, and some ancient sources claim the beam could be seen from 300 stades away, nearly 60 kilometres. Whether or not that figure is accurate, the point is clear. Alexandria built a light specifically to draw ships toward it across the open sea. The city wanted to be found, it wanted to be the destination, and it was. By the 1st century BC, Alexandria was the central nervous system of Eastern Mediterranean trade. Egypt's grain fed Rome. Egypt's linen clothed the empire. Egypt's papyrus was what the ancient world wrote on. Every contract, every letter, every history, every poem that wasn't chiselled into stone was written on paper that came, ultimately, from the Nile Valley and passed through the warehouses of Alexandria. The city's wealth was almost incalculable, and that wealth translated directly into the capacity to build and maintain one of the most powerful navies in the ancient world. Cleopatra was the 7th ruler of her name, Cleopatra the 7th Philopator, and she was a Ptolemaic queen, which is to say she was descended from one of Alexander's generals, Macedonian Greek named Ptolemy, who had seized Egypt after Alexander's death in 323 BC. The Ptolemaic dynasty that Ptolemy founded would rule Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, and from the very beginning they understood something that their predecessors had sometimes forgotten. Egypt's power was not just about the Nile, it was about the sea. The early Ptolemies were extraordinary naval builders. Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who ruled from 285 to 246 BC, was particularly obsessed with ships. He constructed an enormous fleet that dominated the eastern Mediterranean during his reign, and he commissioned vessels that boggled the minds of his contemporaries. There were accounts, some of them clearly exaggerated by the enthusiasm of ancient writers, but grounded in something real, of Ptolemaic warships of almost fantastical size. The historian Calixenus of Rhodes, writing in the 3rd century BC, described a ship called the Tessera Conteras, the 40, which supposedly had 40 rows of oars and could carry over 4,000 oarsmen. Whether or not such a ship was ever actually seaworthy, its existence in the historical record tells you something about the ambition and the resources of the Ptolemaic navy at its height. More importantly, the Ptolemies controlled Cyprus, which was then as now one of the most strategically important islands in the eastern Mediterranean, and they had alliances and trading posts scattered across the Aegean, the Levant, and the coasts of what is now Libya and Tunisia. Their navy wasn't just a military asset, it was an economic one, a way of protecting trade routes, enforcing customs duties, and projecting Egyptian power into the wider Mediterranean world without having to march armies overland. But by Cleopatra's time, much of that power had eroded. The later Ptolemies were, with a few exceptions, neither the military strategists nor the administrators their ancestors had been. The dynasty had grown inward-looking, consumed by court intrigues, assassinations, and the endless complications of a ruling family that practiced sibling marriage as a matter of policy, a practice the Ptolemies had inherited from Egyptian tradition, and which, whatever its symbolic value, produced the kind of dynastic instability that tends to undermine empires. Cyprus had been lost and then recovered. The great Ptolemaic holdings in the Aegean had shrunk. Rome had grown, and Egypt, wealthy as it still was, had become increasingly dependent on Roman goodwill rather than Greek military power. This was the world Cleopatra was born into, and it shaped everything she would later do, including the decision to build a navy. Cleopatra was educated in the manner of a Ptolemaic royal, which in practice meant she received one of the finest educations available anywhere in the ancient world. The Museion, the great research institution attached to the Library of Alexandria, was effectively her intellectual playground. She studied mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and rhetoric. She learned to speak multiple languages. Ancient sources, most notably the biographer Plutarch writing about a century after her death, tell us that she spoke 9 languages, including Egyptian, which was remarkable because most of the Ptolemies had never bothered to learn the native language of the country they ruled. She reportedly also spoke Ethiopian, the language of the troglodytes, presumably some dialect spoken along Egypt's southern frontier, Hebrew, Arabic, Syriac, Median, Parthian, and of course Latin and Greek. This linguistic facility was not merely an intellectual accomplishment, it was a political tool of extraordinary sophistication. When Cleopatra spoke to foreign ambassadors in their own tongue, without an interpreter, she was doing something that almost no ruler in the ancient world had done before her, and the effect on those ambassadors was reportedly electric. It said, "I have taken the trouble to understand you. I am not above you, I am with you." It was a form of charisma that operated through the intellect rather than merely through appearance, though ancient sources are also clear that she was personally magnetic in more conventional ways as well. Cleopatra became queen at 18, in 51 BC, following the death of her father Ptolemy XII, a man the Alexandrians had given the unflattering nickname of Orleats, the flute player, on account of his musical hobbies and his general failure to live up to the expectations of a pharaoh. Ptolemy XII had spent a significant portion of his reign in Rome, begging Roman senators to support his claim to the throne against various rival factions within Egypt, and had returned home with Roman backing and a massive debt. His rule was not a triumphant one, and the Egypt he left to Cleopatra was financially strained and politically precarious. She inherited the throne jointly with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, who was perhaps 10 years old when they began co-ruling. The arrangement was a marriage in name, Ptolemaic practice required it, though it was obviously not a real marriage in any meaningful sense. Cleopatra was the dominant partner from the beginning, and that dominance quickly created enemies among her brother's advisors, chief among them a courtier named Pothinus, who resented her competence and her independence with the particular intensity of a man who had planned to rule through a child and found himself outmaneuvered by an adult. Within 3 years, Pothinus and his allies had engineered a palace coup that drove Cleopatra out of Alexandria. She retreated to the eastern edge of Egypt, near the border with Syria, and began assembling an army, because Cleopatra was not the kind of person who accepted exile as a permanent condition. It was at this point that Julius Caesar sailed into the story, and by extension, into Alexandria's harbour. Caesar arrived in Egypt in the autumn of 48 BC, pursuing his great rival, Pompey, who had fled there after being defeated at the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece. He arrived to find that Pompey was already dead, killed on a small boat in the harbour by agents of Ptolemy XIII's court, who had hoped that murdering Rome's losing general would please Rome's winning one. Caesar reportedly wept when he was presented with Pompey's head, though whether those tears were genuine grief or political theatre is something historians have debated ever since. Caesar had arrived with a relatively small force, about 3,200 legionaries and 800 cavalry, and found himself in a city that was, to put it diplomatically, less than welcoming. The Alexandrian population was volatile, nationalist, and deeply suspicious of Roman intentions. Caesar's soldiers behaved with the casual arrogance of conquerors, requisitioning houses and insulting locals, and riots broke out almost immediately. Caesar sequestered himself in the royal palace complex, which occupied the northeastern tip of Alexandria's harbour, and found himself effectively under siege in one of the world's most magnificent cities. It was into this tense, dangerous situation that Cleopatra chose to make her entrance. The story of how she did it has been told so many times that it has taken on the quality of legend, which does not mean it is untrue, but it does mean we should hold it with a certain gentleness. According to Plutarch, she had herself smuggled into the palace wrapped in a linen sack or possibly a carpet. The sources differ on this detail, and it matters less than the audacity of the act itself. She could not approach Caesar through the harbour, because her brother's forces controlled it. She could not enter through the city gates, because she would be arrested. So she found another way in. She always found another way in. Caesar was 52. Cleopatra was 21. What passed between them in that first meeting is, of course, unknowable, but what emerged from it was a political alliance of enormous consequence. Caesar would support Cleopatra's claim to the Egyptian throne, and Egypt would support, financially, logistically, materially, the operations of Rome's most powerful general in the Eastern Mediterranean. It was not simply a love affair, though it may well have been that too. It was a transaction between two extraordinary minds who recognized in each other a utility that transcended the personal. The civil war between Cleopatra and her brother played out in part on Alexandria's harbour, in what is called the Alexandrian War, a strange claustrophobic conflict fought in the streets and waterways of a single city. One of its most dramatic episodes was the burning of the Alexandrian docks. Caesar, facing a shortage of ships and the threat of being cut off by sea, ordered his men to set fire to Egyptian vessels docked in the harbour to prevent them falling into enemy hands. Ancient sources, most dramatically the later writer Plutarch, claim that this fire spread to the Great Library of Alexandria and destroyed part of it, though this claim has been debated for centuries, and most modern historians believe the library survived this incident, only to face other threats in later centuries. What is certain is that the harbour burned, that ships were lost, and that the naval dimension of Egyptian power was significantly reduced in this period. Caesar emerged victorious, Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile while fleeing a battle, and Cleopatra was restored to her throne. She was now co-ruler with another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, and she was pregnant with Caesar's child. Her position was powerful but precarious, dependent on Roman goodwill, and on her own ability to navigate a political landscape that grew more treacherous with every passing year. Caesar returned to Rome. Cleopatra followed him there in 46 BC and spent roughly 2 years in the city, lodged in Caesar's villa across the Tiber, where she received the intellectuals, artists, and politicians of Rome with a poise that reportedly fascinated and unnerved them in equal measure. When Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March, 44 BC, stabbed 23 times on the floor of the Senate, Cleopatra was in Rome. She left almost immediately. She returned to Alexandria, and she began to rebuild. Before we can fully understand what Cleopatra was building and why, we need to spend some time with the ships themselves, because ancient naval warfare was a world utterly unlike anything that came before or after it, and without understanding its logic, the events at Actium make no sense. The dominant warship of the ancient Mediterranean world was the galley, and specifically the trireme, a long narrow vessel powered primarily by oars, with 3 banks of rowers stacked vertically on either side. The trireme had been the dominant naval weapon of the classical Greek world, and by Cleopatra's time it had evolved into something more complex. The ships that the Ptolemies built and that Cleopatra later commissioned were not triremes in the classical Athenian sense, but something heavier, slower, and more formidable. Polyremes, ships with multiple banks of oars and sometimes enormous crews, designed not just for the quick, darting, ram and run tactics of the classical era, but for the kind of sustained, brutal, close-quarters fighting that had come to dominate Hellenistic and Roman naval warfare. The polyreme, the many-oared ship, came in various configurations that ancient writers described by numbers: quinqueremes with 5 banks or 5 oarsmen per oar set, hexaremes with 6, and up to the almost mythological vessels with 10 or more designations. The numbering system is somewhat ambiguous in the ancient sources, and scholars have debated for decades exactly what these designations meant in terms of physical arrangement. The most widely accepted theory is that the numbers refer not to separate banks of oars, but to the number of rowers pulling on a set of oars in a given vertical section of the ship. So a quinquereme might have had 3 banks of oars, with 2 men on the upper oar, 2 on the middle, and 1 on the lower, giving a total of 5 per section. What this meant in practice was that these ships were enormous. A Roman or Hellenistic quinquereme might be anywhere from 35 to 40 metres long, and carry a crew of 300 or more men, the majority of them rowers. The oarsmen worked in close, airless conditions, seated on benches covered with leather cushions, pulling in rhythms dictated by an officer called the Keliusts, the stroke caller, who kept time with a flute or by chanting. In battle, the oarsmen worked at maximum pace for short bursts, because at combat speed the exertion was so intense that even trained men could sustain it for only a few minutes at a time. The primary weapon of these ships was the ram. A bronze ram, called the embolon in Greek, the rostrum in Latin, was mounted at the waterline at the bow of the ship, projecting forward like a great bronze fist. The ram did not simply punch a hole in an enemy ship. It was designed to drive into the enemy vessel at an angle, shearing off oars and destabilizing the crew, and then be quickly withdrawn before the 2 ships became tangled. The ideal attack was a maneuver called the diekplus, sailing through the enemy's line, turning sharply, and striking the exposed oar bank of an enemy ship from the side or rear. But by the 1st century BC, naval warfare had shifted significantly away from this elegant geometry. Ships had grown so large and heavy that the quick dancing tactics of the classical trireme were harder to execute. Instead, fleets increasingly relied on missile weapons, artillery in the form of catapults and ballistae mounted on deck and on boarding. The goal in a Hellenistic or Roman naval engagement was often not to sink the enemy, but to grapple, board, and take possession of ships, turning the sea battle into something that resembled land fighting on floating platforms. Towers were built on warship decks. Legionaries trained specifically in the techniques of boarding and hand-to-hand fighting on moving ships. The Romans had taken this tendency furthest with an invention they called the corvus, the raven, a spiked boarding bridge that could be dropped onto an enemy vessel, hooking into its deck and holding the 2 ships together while Roman legionaries swarmed across. This device had won them their first major naval victories against Carthage in the 3rd century BC, and it represented a Roman philosophy of naval warfare that was really just land warfare conducted at sea. The Romans believed their soldiers were better fighters than anyone else's soldiers, and so their naval strategy was essentially get the ships close together and let the soldiers do the rest. Egypt's naval tradition was somewhat different. The Ptolemies had inherited a Hellenistic naval culture that emphasized the skill of professional sailors and the speed of well-built ships, and they had access to timber, shipbuilding knowledge, and seamanship traditions from across the eastern Mediterranean. The sailors of Cyprus, which the Ptolemies controlled for much of their dynasty's history, were among the finest in the ancient world. Egyptian grain merchants had been navigating the Mediterranean for centuries, and Alexandria's royal dockyards, the Neorion, the naval base situated in the royal harbour, had been building warships continuously since the dynasty's founding. The Mediterranean itself is a geography that shapes history. It is a closed sea, almost closed, connected to the Atlantic only through the narrow Strait of Gibraltar, which the ancients called the Pillars of Hercules, and its enclosed nature meant that it was navigable in a way that open oceans were not. At least with the technology available in the ancient world, sailors could almost always keep land in sight or know that land was not far away. But the Mediterranean is also a sea of extremes. Its winds are seasonal and sometimes violent. The Etesian winds that blow steadily from the north in summer, the sudden sirocco from the south that can turn the sea from glassy calm to terrifying chop in hours. The famous meltemi in the Aegean that made ancient sailors grip their oars and pray. Navigation in antiquity was a skill built on an intimate knowledge of these winds, of the currents, of the behaviour of particular stretches of water at particular times of year. Experienced Mediterranean sailors could read the colour of the water, the behaviour of birds, the smell of the air, and the shape of clouds to predict what the sea was about to do. This knowledge was passed down through generations of seafaring families and was as jealously guarded as any military secret. For Egypt, the geography of the Mediterranean created both an opportunity and a vulnerability. The Egyptian coast is long, relatively straight, and largely devoid of the sheltered bays and natural harbours that make a coastline easy to defend. West of Alexandria, the coast becomes the featureless expanse of what is now Libya, sand and wind and occasional shallow lagoons, none of them offering significant shelter to a fleet. East of Alexandria, the Nile Delta creates a complex geography of river mouths, marshes, and shallow coastal waters that were easier to navigate for locals than for outsiders, but that also made defence difficult. Alexandria's harbour was therefore the key to Egypt's naval power and its vulnerability. Whoever held Alexandria held Egypt's connection to the sea, and whoever held Egypt's connection to the sea controlled the flow of grain and wealth that made Egypt the richest nation in the ancient Mediterranean world. This is why the city's defences, including its naval defences, were so elaborate, and why Cleopatra's attention to her fleet was not merely a matter of military pride, but of existential necessity. In the years following Caesar's assassination, Cleopatra moved with remarkable speed and purpose. She was 26 years old, she was sole ruler of Egypt. Ptolemy XIV had died under circumstances that ancient sources describe with careful vagueness, most modern historians assuming Cleopatra had him killed, which was a reasonable precaution given that ambitious younger siblings rarely made comfortable co-regents. And she had a 3-year-old son, Caesarion, whom she had declared co-ruler and whom she presented to the world as the son of Julius Caesar, and therefore the heir to both Egyptian and Roman greatness. The political situation in Rome was chaotic. Caesar's assassination had been followed immediately by a new civil war, as his supporters and his murderers fought for control of the Republic. The two primary forces were, on one side, Caesar's great-nephew, an adopted heir Octavian, who was only 18 but possessed a cold political intelligence that would prove devastating to everyone who underestimated it, and on the other side Mark Antony, Caesar's closest general and lieutenant, who had the soldiers, the charisma, and the military experience that Octavian lacked. For a time they cooperated. They and a third man, Lepidus, formed the second triumvirate and carved the Roman world between them. But everyone who looked at this arrangement clearly could see that it was temporary. Octavian and Antony were too different, too ambitious, and too distrustful to share power for long. Cleopatra watched all of this from Alexandria, and she made her calculations. She had already demonstrated the value of Egypt to Rome once through Caesar. She would do it again more comprehensively through Antony. But this required preparation. It required, among other things, a fleet. The royal dockyards of Alexandria were situated in the royal harbour, the eastern section of the great harbour, in a complex that included not only the building slips and dry docks, where ships were constructed and repaired, but also the arsenals where weapons and rigging were stored, the warehouses where timber was seasoned and naval supplies stockpiled, and the administrative buildings where the logistical work of running a navy, the accounting, the recruitment, the record-keeping, was conducted. ancient Alexandria was a city of extraordinary bureaucratic sophistication, and the navy was no exception. Every ship, every oar, every length of rope was inventoried and tracked. The timber for the ships came from multiple sources. Cedar, the finest shipbuilding wood of the ancient world, came primarily from Lebanon. The forests of the Lebanese mountains had been supplying timber to the Mediterranean world since the Bronze Age, and the Ptolemies maintained trading relationships with the cedar-producing regions that went back generations. Pine came from Macedonia and the Aegean Islands, fir from Asia Minor. The wood was felled, shaped into planks, and then seasoned, sometimes for years, before it was considered ready for shipbuilding. A ship built with unseasoned timber would rot quickly in the seawater, and the Ptolemaic dockyards maintained large timber stores to ensure that wood was always available in the proper state of preparation. The ships were built using a technique that modern scholars call shell-first construction, which was the standard method in the ancient Mediterranean world, and which differs fundamentally from the way wooden ships would later be built in medieval and early modern Europe. In shell-first construction, the hull was built from the outside in. The keel was laid first. Then the planks of the hull were assembled around it edge to edge, held together by mortise and tenon joints, thousands of small wooden pegs fitted into corresponding slots in the adjacent plank. And only once the outer shell was complete were internal frames and ribs inserted to strengthen the structure. The result was a hull of great strength and flexibility, capable of withstanding both the stress of rowing and the impact of ramming. The hulls were then coated in pitch to waterproof them, and in some cases covered with lead sheathing below the waterline to protect against the turidi worm, the shipworm, which was the great enemy of wooden ships in warm Mediterranean waters. A well-maintained hull could last for years. A neglected one could be riddled with worm damage within a single sailing season. The rowers were recruited from a broad population. Some were free men, Egyptian farmers who worked the oars in the off-season for pay, Greek immigrants who had settled in Alexandria, sailors from Cyprus and other Ptolemaic territories. Some were undoubtedly enslaved people, though the ancient evidence suggests that enslaved rowers were less common in Ptolemaic and Roman navies than popular imagination tends to assume. Rowing a warship required skill, coordination, and a level of physical condition that was difficult to maintain in enslaved populations who were not being treated well, and experienced rowing crews who understood the rhythms and signals of naval combat were far more valuable than any individual ship. The knowledge was in the people, not just the vessel. Training a rowing crew to the level of competence required for naval combat took months. The rowers had to learn not just the basic mechanics of pulling an oar, but the complex language of signals by which a ship was manoeuvred. The drum beats, the flute calls, the shouted commands that told them when to pull hard, when to back water, when to hold their oars still. They had to learn to do this in conditions of noise, fear, and physical exhaustion, when the ship was heeling under the impact of waves or the stress of a tight turn, when the man beside them might be screaming, when smoke from burning ships was drifting across the water and making it hard to see the Caeliustes signals. This was not a skill that could be acquired quickly, and the Ptolemaic navy had a tradition of maintaining professional trained crews precisely because the alternative, improvised rowers scraped together in an emergency, was barely functional in combat. How many ships did Cleopatra have? This is a question that ancient sources give us somewhat different answers to, and modern historians have to navigate between the exaggerations of Roman writers who had political reasons to make Antony and Cleopatra's fleet seem formidably large, because a bigger fleet makes their eventual defeat at Actium more impressive, and the genuine uncertainty about the size of Egyptian naval resources at this period. What seems reasonably clear from the ancient accounts is that, by the time Cleopatra's fleet was ready to cooperate with Antony's Roman naval forces in the late 30s BC, Egypt contributed somewhere between 200 and 500 warships to the joint force. The figure most often cited in connection with the Battle of Actium is around 230 Egyptian warships, though some sources give higher numbers. Of these, the majority were probably quinqueremes and hexaremes. heavy warships capable of carrying artillery and boarding parties, with a smaller number of larger vessels and a supporting cast of lighter scout ships and supply vessels. In addition to the warships themselves, Cleopatra assembled an enormous fleet of merchant ships, grain transports and supply vessels that would accompany the fleet and sustain it on campaign. Ancient naval operations were deeply constrained by logistics. Warships of this period could not carry enough food and water to stay at sea for more than a few days at most, and they needed to put into shore regularly to take on supplies, carry out repairs and rest their crews. The supply fleet was therefore not a luxury but a necessity, and Cleopatra invested heavily in it. She also supplied gold, vast quantities of gold. Antony's Roman forces, formidable as they were chronically underfunded, and the alliance with Egypt was worth as much in coin as it was in ships. Ancient sources suggest that Cleopatra contributed something on the order of 20,000 talents to the joint enterprise, a figure that's almost impossible to translate into modern currency with any precision, but which represented a staggering proportion of Egypt's annual tax revenue. She was not simply lending a fleet, she was financing a war. This financial commitment was both her greatest strength and, in a way, her greatest vulnerability, because it meant that she was personally invested in the outcome of this war in a way that made it impossible for her to withdraw gracefully if things went wrong. She had put everything she had, her fleet, her treasury, her personal presence, into this alliance. If it succeeded, she would be the queen of the Eastern Mediterranean, Antony's empress in all but name, and her son Caesarion would have a claim to a power that encompassed both Egypt and Rome. If it failed, she would have nothing, and in the ancient world, queens who had nothing rarely survived for long. The meeting that would define the second half of Cleopatra's life took place in the city of Tarsus, in what is now southern Turkey, in the autumn of 41 BC. Mark Antony had summoned her as though she were a subject rather than a sovereign, to account for Egypt's alleged support of his enemies during the recent civil war. Cleopatra chose to respond to this summons in a way that would be remembered for 2,000 years. She came by ship. This is where the fleet enters the story not just as a military asset but as a stage set, a piece of political theatre conceived and directed by Cleopatra herself. Plutarch describes the arrival in language that he was clearly translating from an earlier source, and even filtered through centuries of retelling. It retains a vividness that suggests it was witnessed by people who never forgot it. The ship was a royal barge, a thalamigos, a roofed pleasure vessel of the kind the Ptolemies had been building for generations, but transformed into something almost surreally magnificent. Its stern was gilded, its purple sails were spread to catch the wind, its silver oars moved to the rhythm of flutes and pipes. The deck was scattered with flowers, and the smoke of incense drifted from burners along its sides, so that the scent of the Queen's arrival was noticed on the shore before the ship itself became visible. And at the centre of all of this, on a couch under a canopy of gold cloth, dressed as Aphrodite, and attended by young attendants costumed as Eros and the Graces, was Cleopatra. The crowds on the Cydnus riverbank reportedly abandoned Antony's welcoming ceremony to run to the water's edge and watch her pass. Antony waited at his tribunal, reportedly alone by the end, surrounded only by the emptiness left by everyone who had gone to see the Queen of Egypt arrive. The story has the quality of myth because Cleopatra was constructing myth in real time. She understood something that very few rulers before or since have grasped with such clarity, that power is not just what you do, but how you appear to do it. She was not simply arriving at a meeting. She was demonstrating that she could command the sea itself, that she was at home on the water in a way that no land-based general could easily match, that Egypt's wealth was so vast and so easy for her to deploy that even a diplomatic visit became an act of splendour. Antony was 42 years old, a professional soldier, a man of enormous physical energy and genuine military genius, and reportedly a man of considerable appetites for food, for wine, for company, for life in general. He was also, under all of that bluster, politically shrewd in ways that his eventual defeat would cause later generations to underestimate. He recognised in Cleopatra not just a fascinating woman but an indispensable ally, and she recognised in him not just a powerful man but the means by which she might secure Egypt's independence and her son's future for another generation. The dinner Antony hosted that first evening and the dinner Cleopatra hosted the following night, reportedly so spectacular, so elaborate, so perfectly managed that Antony's own considerable resources were made to look modest by comparison, began what would become one of antiquity's most consequential partnerships. They spent the winter of 41 to 40 BC in Alexandria together, and contemporary accounts describe a period of extraordinary mutual indulgence. Banquets, games, philosophical debates, hunting expeditions, and an elaborate private society they called the inimitable livers. The word doesn't translate perfectly from the Greek, but the sense is something like those who live incomparably, a club of two dedicated to finding the most magnificent ways to spend time. But it was not all pleasure. Beneath the theatre of their public life together, serious diplomatic and military business was being conducted. Antony needed Egypt's resources for his planned campaign against Parthia, the great empire to the east that had humiliated Rome when it destroyed an army at Carrhae in 53 BC, killing the general Crassus and capturing the legionary standards, a wound to Roman pride that had never healed. Cleopatra needed Antony's military backing to secure her position and her son's claim to legitimacy. They each had something the other needed, and they were both intelligent enough to know it. The alliance deepened over the years that followed. Antony and Cleopatra had 3 children together, twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, born in 40 BC, and a younger son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, born in 36 BC. Antony conducted his Parthian campaign with mixed results. He failed to achieve the decisive victory he wanted, losing a significant portion of his army in a disastrous retreat. But he did recover some territory, and the campaign was not a catastrophic failure. He and Cleopatra met repeatedly in the years between 40 and 34 BC, their relationship growing in both personal and political intensity. In 34 BC, Antony staged a ceremony in Alexandria that became known to posterity as the Donations of Alexandria, and which would eventually provide Octavian with the propaganda ammunition to destroy him. In an enormous public ceremony in the Gymnasium of Alexandria, Antony seated Cleopatra on a golden throne and declared her Queen of Kings, essentially Empress of the East. Caesarion was declared King of Kings and co-ruler of Egypt. Their children were given royal titles and territories throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Alexander Helios was to receive Armenia, Media, and the Parthian territories that Rome had not yet conquered. Cleopatra Selene was given Cyrene and Libya. Ptolemy Philadelphus was assigned Phoenicia, Syria, and Cilicia. Much of this was aspirational rather than actual. Rome controlled most of these territories, and Antony was granting things he did not entirely have the right to give. But the symbolism was potent and deliberate. What Antony was doing, or what it looked like he was doing, was creating an alternative to Rome in the east, a Hellenistic empire centered on Alexandria rather than Rome, with Cleopatra as its queen and her children as its future rulers. It was the dream of a new Alexander, a unified eastern Mediterranean under a single monarch, combining Greek culture, Egyptian wealth, and Roman military power. In Rome, Octavian looked at this and understood exactly how to use it. He had already been waging a slow, patient propaganda campaign against Antony, presenting him as a man who had abandoned Roman values, gone native in the East, and fallen so completely under Cleopatra's influence that he could no longer be trusted to act in Rome's interests. The Donations of Alexandria were exactly the kind of evidence he needed. He had Antony's will, allegedly, read aloud to the Roman Senate, claiming it confirmed that Antony wanted to be buried in Alexandria rather than Rome, and intended to give Roman territories to his Egyptian children. Whether the will was genuine, fabricated, or simply selectively read, the effect on the Senate was electric. Rome declared war. Not on Antony, that would have been a civil war, embarrassing and divisive. Rome declared war on Cleopatra. Octavian was careful to frame the coming conflict as a defensive war against a foreign queen who had seduced a Roman general into treason, rather than as a continuation of the Roman civil wars that had been tearing the Republic apart for decades. It was a brilliant political maneuver, and it made the coming battle inevitable. The mobilization for the coming war between Antony and Octavian was one of the largest military preparations in the ancient world since Alexander had marched east a century before. Both sides understood that the outcome would determine the fate of the Mediterranean world for generations, and both sides threw everything they had into it. Antony and Cleopatra established their headquarters at Samos in the winter of 32 to 31 BC, and then moved to Athens and then to the western coast of Greece. Antony's combined Roman forces numbered something on the order of 100,000 soldiers and between 500 and 800 warships, a figure that includes Cleopatra's Egyptian contingent. By any standard of the ancient world, this was an enormous army and fleet. Antony had been fighting wars for 20 years, and his legions were experienced professional soldiers. Cleopatra had brought her ships, her sailors and her treasury, and her personal involvement in the campaign was absolute. She would be there, on the fleet, in command of the Egyptian contingent throughout the coming battle. Octavian had fewer ships. Ancient sources suggest around 400, which he had built at extraordinary speed in the ports of Italy. But his naval, Commander Marcus Agrippa, was one of the finest military minds of the age. Agrippa was not a charismatic figure. He left no famous speeches, no memorable philosophical writings, no dramatic gestures. What he left was a record of military victory so consistent and comprehensive that it speaks for itself. He had built Octavian's fleet almost from scratch in the preceding years, training crews and designing tactics in the new naval base at Forum Iuli in southern Gaul. And he had recently developed or perfected a weapon that would prove decisive: the harpax, or grappling hook launcher, a catapult designed to fire a grappling hook attached to a rope, which could be used to drag enemy ships within boarding range even if they tried to row away. Through the winter of 32 to 31 BC, Agrippa had been conducting a systematic campaign against Antony's supply lines along the western coast of Greece. He captured the island of Leucas. He took the port of Patras. He seized Corinth. Each capture tightened the noose around Antony's position in western Greece, cutting off the supply routes that his enormous combined force depended on. Antony's army began to suffer from disease and supply shortages. His fleet was unable to patrol the seas effectively because Agrippa's ships were faster, lighter, and more aggressively commanded. The situation was becoming critical, and within Antony's council a debate broke out that would define the entire campaign. The question was simple to state and agonizing to answer: should they fight at sea or on land? Antony's most experienced military advisors, his Roman generals, men who had spent careers fighting in the legions, argued for land. Their reasoning was straightforward. Antony's legions were superb. His soldiers had been fighting and winning for years. A land campaign would play to Rome's greatest strength, which was the disciplined fighting ability of the legionary. Even if Agrippa controlled the seas, Antony could march his army south through Greece, force a land engagement, and use his numerical advantage in infantry to crush Octavian's forces. Cleopatra argued for the sea, and this is where the story becomes complicated, because her argument has been characterized by hostile ancient sources, and Octavian's Rome produced nothing but hostile sources when it came to Cleopatra, as the interference of a woman who wanted to preserve her fleet for flight rather than fight. Plutarch, writing more than a century later and drawing on those earlier Roman sources, presents Cleopatra's advocacy for a naval strategy as essentially selfish, driven by her desire to have the ships ready to carry herself and her treasure back to Egypt if things went badly. But this interpretation does not survive scrutiny. Cleopatra was not a naive observer of military strategy. She had been thinking about naval power for years. She had financed and organised a fleet precisely because she understood that sea power was the key to the Eastern Mediterranean. Her argument for fighting at sea was not strategic cowardice, but strategic logic. Agrippa was already strangling Antony's supply lines by sea. If Antony abandoned his fleet and fought on land, he would still need to deal with Agrippa's naval dominance, and without ships, he would have no way to maintain the long coastline from which his army operated, or to threaten Octavian's own supply lines back to Italy. Moreover, the longer the campaign lasted, the more Antony's forces suffered from disease and desertion, while Octavian could continue to be resupplied from Italy across a sea he now effectively controlled. There was also a more fundamental strategic calculation. Antony and Cleopatra needed to win decisively, not merely hold on. They needed to break through Agrippa's blockade, reach the open sea, and from there either force a decisive naval engagement on terms more favourable to themselves, or regroup in the east where their strength was greatest. A land campaign against Octavian might succeed, but it would be slow, grinding and expensive, and every month of delay was a month in which more of Antony's allies could be peeled away by Octavian's patient diplomacy and his careful management of Roman public opinion. In the end, the decision was made. They would fight at sea. They would attempt to break through Agrippa's blockade and reach open water. The fleet would assemble in the Gulf of Ambracia, a large sheltered body of water on the western coast of Greece, separated from the open Ionian Sea by a narrow entrance near the promontory called Actium. And on September 2nd, 31 BC, they would row out to meet whatever was waiting for them. But before they could even begin to row, something had already gone deeply wrong. The disease that had been afflicting Antony's forces throughout the winter and spring had grown worse. Men were dying in significant numbers. Ancient sources mentioned fevers, dysentery, and other camp diseases which were the constant companions of large armies in the ancient world, and which were particularly lethal in the marshy, mosquito-infested coastline of western Greece. And something else was happening too, something that was perhaps more damaging than disease: defections. Antony's allies, the client kings and local rulers who had pledged their support to him, began quietly to change sides. Some sent messages to Octavian, some simply stopped sending the supplies and reinforcements they had promised. Domitius Ahenobarbus, one of Antony's most senior Roman commanders, defected directly to Octavian just days before the battle. He was old and ill, and he died shortly after, but his defection was a devastating blow to morale. When Antony inspected his fleet in the days before the battle, he found that he did not have enough healthy rowers to man all his ships. He made a decision that ancient sources recorded with horror. He ordered a significant number of ships burned, not captured by the enemy, not sunk in battle, burned by his own men, to reduce the fleet to a size that his available crews could actually operate. The flames were visible from the shore, and the smoke drifted across the gulf, and everyone who saw it understood what it meant. The most powerful fleet in the eastern Mediterranean was destroying itself before the battle had even begun. The morning of September 2nd, 31 BC, came in grey and still. The Gulf of Ambracia lay flat and quiet behind the massed ships of Antony's fleet, and at the narrow entrance to the gulf, the channel that led to the open Ionian Sea, the combined forces of Octavian and Agrippa waited. They had been waiting for days, hoping that Antony would come out because Agrippa's strategy depended on it. The blockade was costing him too. Every day of waiting was a day of wear on ships and crews, a day during which the weather could shift, a day during which the strategic situation could change. Antony needed the wind. Naval strategy in this period was complicated by the fact that warships were primarily oar-powered, but that rowing against a strong headwind was exhausting and slowed a vessel dramatically. In the afternoon, the prevailing winds in this part of the Ionian Sea typically blew from the northwest, which would have favoured ships attempting to break out to the south, exactly the direction in which Antony and Cleopatra hoped to go. The plan, as best as modern historians can reconstruct it from the fragmentary and often contradictory ancient sources, was to row out into the channel, engage Octavian's fleet, and when the afternoon wind picked up, unfurl the sails and use the wind to break through to open water. This is an important detail, and one that has been obscured by 2,000 years of retrospective narrative. Ancient warships normally stowed their sails before battle. The masts and sails were heavy, created wind resistance, and were a fire hazard in the chaos of close naval combat. A fleet that went into battle with its sails aboard was a fleet that intended to fight. A fleet that kept its sails raised or ready was a fleet that had a plan for what came after the initial engagement. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet carried their sails. This was noticed. This was commented on. In the aftermath, it was used as evidence of their cowardice, their intention to flee. But carrying the sails was not cowardice. It was the plan. The plan was never to fight to the last ship in the Gulf of Ambracia. The plan was to break through, escape to the open sea and regroup. The question was only whether the breakthrough could be achieved. The two fleets were roughly comparable in total fighting strength, though Antony's ships were significantly larger. His heavy quinqueremes and hexaremes towered over Agrippa's lighter, faster vessels. Antony had drawn up his fleet in a line across the mouth of the Gulf, with his right wing commanded by Gaius Sosius, his left by Gellius Publicola, and his centre by himself. Cleopatra's Egyptian squadron, roughly 60 warships, the finest of her fleet, accompanied by the treasure ships and supply vessels, sat in the second line, directly behind the centre. Octavian and Agrippa had drawn up opposite them, with Agrippa commanding the left wing, the wing that would face Antony's right commanded by Sosius, and Octavian's general Lucius Aruntius commanding the centre. Octavian himself was reportedly unwell that morning. Ancient sources claim he had a prophetic dream the night before the battle, and that a man had encountered him on the road to his ship, leading a donkey, and that Octavian had asked the man his name and been told it was Eutychus, fortunate, and his donkey was named Nikon, victor. Whether this omen-seeking reflects genuine anxiety, or was added to the story afterward, it speaks to the atmosphere of the morning. The battle began slowly. There was a period, ancient sources call it hours, though this seems long, in which the two fleets faced each other without engaging, both sides apparently waiting for some advantage, some shift in conditions, some opening. Agrippa's lighter ships were faster and more manoeuvrable, but Antony's heavier ships were formidable in close quarters fighting and would be devastating if they could get alongside Agrippa's vessels. Agrippa wanted to avoid that. He wanted to use his speed and manoeuvrability to keep the engagement fluid, to tire the heavy ships, to look for openings. The battle began on the wings. Agrippa's left wing started to push outward, threatening to extend beyond Antony's right wing and get around behind it, a classic flanking manoeuvre. Antony's right wing, commanded by Sosius, had to respond by extending its own line, rowing outward to match Agrippa's movement. This created exactly the kind of fluid, extended engagement that Agrippa wanted, and that played to the strengths of his lighter, faster ships. In the centre, the fighting was brutal and slow. Antony's heavy ships drove forward, trying to close the distance to Octavian's centre, but the lighter ships could back water faster than the heavy ones could advance. Agrippa's harpax, the grappling hook launcher, proved devastatingly effective. Ships that were grappled by the hooks and hauled in range were boarded by Roman legionaries who fought with the systematic, trained ferocity of professional soldiers. The deck of a warship under boarding attack was a confined, horrifying space. No room to manoeuvre, smoke from fire ships drifting across the water, the screaming of wounded men, the crack and groan of ship timbers straining under the press of combat. How long this central engagement lasted exactly is unclear. The ancient sources give inconsistent timings, and we should expect this. No one fighting on a warship deck in 31 BC had a reliable way to track the hours, and memory under stress distorts time in both directions. What seems clear is that by the middle of the afternoon, neither side had achieved a decisive breakthrough, and Antony's heavier ships, though formidable, were tiring. And then the wind came. In the early afternoon, the northwest wind came up, as it often does in that part of the Ionian Sea in early September, and Cleopatra's squadron, which had been waiting in the second line behind Antony's centre, unfurled its sails. What happened next has been the subject of debate for 2,000 years. The ancient sources, primarily Plutarch, Dio Cassius and the poet Horace, none of whom were present and all of whom were writing from the perspective of the Roman world that Octavian would create, describe Cleopatra's decision as a flight, a panicked, shameful retreat. Plutarch says that when the Egyptian ships turned south and ran before the wind, Antony, who saw them going, abandoned his own command and followed her. He took a small, fast galley and rowed out to her flagship, and was hauled aboard, and sat alone in the prow for 3 days, unwilling to speak or eat, his army and his remaining fleet left behind to face Octavian alone. This is the version of events that became canonical. Cleopatra fled, and Antony followed, abandoning his men out of infatuation with a foreign queen. It was the perfect story for Octavian's propaganda, proof that Antony had become so enslaved to Cleopatra's influence that he had literally abandoned a battle in progress to chase after her fleeing ship. But several things about this account are puzzling, and they have led a number of modern historians to question whether the ancient narrative captures what actually happened. The sails. Antony's fleet had kept its sails aboard throughout the battle, an unusual and notable decision that the ancient sources themselves record. If Cleopatra's breakout with the sails was unplanned, a panic-driven flight, why were the sails aboard in the first place? Why were they rigged and ready to be used at exactly the moment the afternoon wind arrived? The more convincing interpretation, developed by scholars including Adrian Goldsworthy and Dwayne Roller among others, is that the breakout was the plan, that Cleopatra's squadron had always been intended as the force that would run before the wind when it came, carrying the treasury and the surviving ships to Egypt while Antony's forces engaged the enemy and bought time. The question was whether Antony intended to go with them or to stay with his fleet, and his decision, if it was his decision, if Plutarch's account is accurate at all, to follow Cleopatra rather than remain with his men, is the decision that destroyed him, because his remaining forces, left without their commander, did not simply dissolve. They fought on for an extraordinary additional period, some accounts say until the following day, before the legionaries in Antony's land camp, learning that Antony had gone and the naval battle was lost, negotiated their surrender to Octavian. The navy that had not broken out was either captured or burned. The men who had rowed those ships, who had trained for months and years, who had pulled oars in the summer heat of the Aegean and the cooler waters of the Ionian, most of them survived. They were integrated into Octavian's forces because experienced rowers were too valuable to waste. Cleopatra's squadron, sailing south before the wind, left the battle behind. Ahead of them lay the open sea, and beyond that, Egypt. The voyage south from Actium to Egypt was not a simple one, even for a squadron of ships that had escaped the battle. The Ionian Sea in autumn could be treacherous, and the fleet that Cleopatra led was not intact and undamaged. Some of the ships had been in the outer edges of the engagement. All of them had been rowing and manoeuvring for hours in conditions of stress and fear. The crews were exhausted, the ships were at varying levels of readiness, and the treasury ships were slow. The fleet put in at the island of Cephallenia, off the western coast of Greece, to rest and take on water. It was here, according to some ancient sources, that news reached them of the full extent of the disaster. Antony's land forces had surrendered, his remaining naval forces had been captured or destroyed. The client kings who had pledged their support were already in the process of making their peace with Octavian. The carefully constructed coalition of the East was unravelling with extraordinary speed. Antony himself still somewhere in the fleet. The ancient sources are inconsistent about exactly when he rejoined the main body of the squadron from the fast galley he had used to catch up with Cleopatra, was in a condition that Plutarch describes with a kind of pitying detachment. A man who had walked away from everything he was, sitting in isolation, unable to eat or speak, consumed by some mixture of grief and shame and disbelief. The battle, which had taken months to prepare, had been decided in an afternoon. The Eastern Empire that he and Cleopatra had been building for a decade was gone. They sailed on south, hugging the coast of Greece, crossing the Mediterranean toward the Egyptian shore. The fleet entered the harbour of Alexandria, the same harbour where Cleopatra had watched ships come and go for her entire life, the same harbour where the lighthouse had guided sailors home for 2 centuries. In the late summer or early autumn of 31 BC, Cleopatra reportedly arranged for the ships to enter the harbour, with their battle standards flying and with music playing, as though they were returning in triumph. This was not self-delusion. It was information management. She needed to prevent panic in Alexandria, needed to buy time before the news of the defeat spread, needed to keep the population's confidence in her leadership long enough to formulate a response. The response she formulated was extraordinary in its ambition, and ultimately in its impossibility. In the months between the Battle of Actium in September 31 BC and the arrival of Octavian's forces in Egypt in the summer of 30 BC, Cleopatra pursued a strategy that showed, even in defeat, the quality of her mind. She could see that the war was lost. She was not naive about that, but she was not yet prepared to accept that Egypt was lost, or that her children's future was lost, or that everything she had built was simply going to be handed over to Octavian to dispose of as he pleased. She had ships. She still had ships. The squadron that had escaped from Actium, and additional vessels built or requisitioned from the ports of Egypt in the months that followed. And she conceived a plan that was, in retrospect, both brilliant and heartbreaking. She would sail those ships around the African continent, through the Indian Ocean, and establish a new kingdom somewhere beyond Rome's reach. The plan required dragging the fleet overland, or at least some portion of it, across the narrow isthmus of Suez from the Mediterranean side to the Red Sea side, so that they could access the eastern sea routes that Egypt's traders had been using for centuries to reach Arabia, India, and the East African coast. The portage of ships across Suez was not without precedent. Smaller vessels had been dragged across the isthmus in previous centuries, and Egypt had at various points maintained connections between the Nile and the Red Sea through canals and portage routes. But dragging warships, heavy broad-beamed galleys, across a significant stretch of desert was a logistical challenge of enormous complexity. Thousands of men and animals would be needed. Rollers, ropes, improvised slipways. The work began. And then the Nabateans burned the ships. The Nabateans were the Arab kingdom that controlled the trade routes of the northern Arabian Peninsula, and they were old allies of Rome, deeply invested in the trade networks that connected the Mediterranean world with the East. They understood exactly what Cleopatra was planning, and they understood that a new Ptolemaic kingdom established somewhere beyond Rome's reach would be a direct threat to their own commercial interests. So they appeared with fire, and the ships that Cleopatra had dragged to the Red Sea shore, or was in the process of dragging, were burned. Whether this was done with Octavian's encouragement, or simply as an independent act of Nabatean self-interest, the effect was the same. The eastern escape route was closed. Cleopatra was trapped in Egypt. She turned her attention to diplomacy. She opened negotiations with Octavian, who was advancing through the eastern Mediterranean with the methodical patience that characterized everything he did. She offered terms. She would abdicate in favor of her children. She would surrender her treasury. She would cooperate fully with the transition of power. She sent ambassadors. She communicated through intermediaries. And Octavian, who had spent his entire adult life being underestimated, who understood better than almost anyone the dangers of negotiating with someone as intelligent as Cleopatra, responded with polite non-commitments that seemed encouraging, and were not. Antony, meanwhile, made one last attempt at resistance. When Octavian's forces reached the gates of Alexandria in August of 30 BC, Antony led a cavalry charge that briefly, remarkably, pushed Octavian's forces back. It was his last military success. The following day, what remained of his fleet, ships that had survived from Actium, supplemented by local craft, defected to Octavian in the harbour of Alexandria. Antony watched them go from the walls of the city, and that was the end. The end came swiftly, as endings often do after long preparations. Antony received false news that Cleopatra was dead. The ancient sources suggest that Cleopatra sent this message deliberately, though whether it was a calculated gambit that went wrong, or a genuine miscommunication is something we cannot know for certain, and he fell on his sword in the manner of a Roman general who has lost everything. He did not die immediately. The wound was serious but not instantly fatal, and he was carried to the mausoleum that Cleopatra had been constructing for herself in the palace precinct of Alexandria, where Cleopatra was with a small group of attendants. They were together at the end, which the ancient sources recount with a sorrow that seems genuine even through the filter of hostile Roman politics. Antony was pulled up through a window of the mausoleum. He was too heavy to lift easily, and the women inside struggled with ropes while the dying general was hauled upward, and he died in Cleopatra's arms. She's described as crying, tearing her clothes, beating her breast in the manner of Egyptian mourning, calling him lord and husband and general and command. Plutarch, whatever his biases, renders this scene with something that reads like compassion. Cleopatra herself survived another 10 days or so after Antony's death. She was taken into what was essentially comfortable captivity. Octavian needed her alive, at least for now, because his plan was to take her to Rome for his triumph, the great ceremonial procession through the streets of Rome, in which a victorious general displayed his conquest to the Roman public. A triumph was the highest honour Rome could bestow on a general, and Octavian wanted Cleopatra in chains behind his chariot. She knew this. Ancient sources describe meetings between her and Octavian in which she used every tool she had: her intelligence, her beauty, her political acumen, the enormous royal dignity she had maintained through everything that had happened, to try to negotiate some outcome that would protect her children, particularly Caesarion. Octavian was courteous, apparently sympathetic, and gave her nothing. He was 27 years old, and he had been watching powerful people be destroyed by underestimating Cleopatra for his entire adult life. He was not going to make that mistake. She died on August 12, 30 BC. She was 39 years old. The manner of her death has been debated since antiquity. The most famous story, the one that became canonical, is that she arranged for a venomous snake, an asp, an Egyptian cobra, to be brought to her in a basket of figs, and that she allowed the snake to bite her. Plutarch mentions 2 small puncture marks on her arm, but no snake was found in the room. Other ancient sources suggest she used poison concealed in a comb or applied to her skin. The asp is probably legendary, large enough to cause the kind of rapid, dignified death that Cleopatra would have wanted. The snake a symbol of royal power in Egyptian tradition, the perfect final act of a woman who'd been staging her own appearances for her entire life. Whatever the method, she was found dead, along with 2 of her attendants, Eros and Charmian, both of whom had also taken poison or been bitten. The story that Plutarch tells, which has no reason to be invented, is that when Octavian's guards found them, Charmian was still alive, barely, adjusting the diadem on Cleopatra's head with shaking hands. When a guard demanded to know if this was fitting, whether this was right, Charmian replied that it was entirely fitting and worthy of the descendants of so many kings, and then she died too. Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar and the last legitimate Ptolemaic heir, was executed on Octavian's orders, reportedly on the advice of one of Octavian's confidants, who quoted the old Greek saying, "Too many Caesars are not good." He was 17 years old. The other children, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and young Ptolemy Philadelphus, were taken to Rome, where they were indeed displayed in Octavian's triumph, walking in golden chains through the streets of Rome while the city cheered. Then they were given to Octavia, Antony's former Roman wife, whom Antony had left for Cleopatra, to raise. The irony was perhaps deliberate. Cleopatra Selenia, the only daughter, survived and eventually married Juba II, the Numidian king of Mauritania in North Africa, and became a queen in her own right. She was reportedly well educated and cultured, and the coins of Mauritania from her reign sometimes bear her face in the Egyptian style that Cleopatra had made her own. She named her own son Ptolemy. The bloodline continued, though increasingly diluted, until a Ptolemy of Mauritania was executed by the Emperor Caligula in 40 AD, and the last trace of the dynasty was gone. Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus disappeared from the historical record after the triumph. Whether they died young or simply lived as private individuals under Roman rule, we do not know. The ancient sources lose track of them, and the silence is its own kind of sorrow. Egypt became a Roman province, not just any Roman province, a uniquely personal possession of Octavian, who renamed himself Augustus and became the first Roman emperor. Egypt was his personal estate, so sensitive a source of wealth, and so strategically critical that senators and senior military officers were forbidden from entering it without imperial permission. The Ptolemaic administration was dismantled. The great library continued for now. The lighthouse continued to burn, but the royal harbours were Roman harbours now, and the warships that sailed from them were Roman warships. Alexandria did not die when Cleopatra died. The city was too large, too wealthy, too embedded in the economic life of the Mediterranean world to simply stop existing, because its queen was gone and its dynasty was ended. Under Roman rule, Alexandria remained one of the 3 or 4 greatest cities in the empire, a centre of philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and trade that continued to draw scholars and merchants from across the known world. The library persisted in some form. The Mausion continued to function. The harbour continued to move the grain and luxury goods that fed and enriched Rome. But the physical city of ancient Alexandria was slowly swallowing itself. The coastline of Egypt is geologically unstable. The Nile Delta sits atop deep deposits of sediment that are constantly shifting, and the land mass of the delta is prone to subsidence. In the centuries after Cleopatra's death, Alexandria's coastline began to sink. Slowly, incrementally, the harbour area dropped relative to sea level, and structures that had once stood on dry land or at the water's edge began to slide beneath the surface of the Mediterranean. The island of Pharos, where the great lighthouse stood, connected to the mainland by the Heptastadion causeway, sank. Parts of the royal quarter slipped beneath the harbour. The lighthouse itself, which had survived for over 1,000 years after its construction, was damaged by earthquakes in the 10th century and further destroyed in the 14th century, and its stones were eventually used to build a fort, the citadel of Qaitbay, which still stands today on the site where the lighthouse once burned. And beneath the harbour, beneath the grey-green water of the eastern Mediterranean, the ancient city of Alexandria lay waiting. Broken columns, sunken statues, the foundation stones of palaces, scattered amphoras that had once held wine or olive oil, or the pungent fish sauce called garum that the ancient world used the way we use, salt and vinegar combined. And somewhere in the silt and sand and accumulated centuries of marine growth, the remnants of ships. The underwater archaeology of ancient Alexandria is one of the great ongoing adventures of modern scholarship. The water in Alexandria's harbour is murky and shallow, and ancient harbours are notoriously difficult to excavate. They are typically crowded with the remnants of many different periods, the ancient layered over by the medieval, layered over by the early modern, and disentangling one era from another requires extraordinary patience and skill. The first systematic underwater archaeological work in Alexandria's harbour was conducted in the 1990s by a team led by the French archaeologist Franck Goddio, who had developed techniques for large-scale underwater survey using side-scan sonar and other geophysical tools that allowed archaeologists to map the shape of the seabed in detail before beginning any physical excavation. What Goddio's surveys revealed was staggering. Not just scattered artifacts, but entire sections of the ancient city, preserved beneath the water with a degree of completeness that no land site in the Mediterranean could match. The royal quarter of ancient Alexandria, the area called the Bruchaion, which had included the royal palaces, the Museion, the royal harbour, and the mausoleum where Cleopatra had died, lay largely submerged in the eastern harbour. The team found the remains of what appeared to be a royal palace structure. Columns and pavements and the foundations of large buildings spread across the harbour floor at depths of between 4 and 8 metres. They found statues, a colossal sphinx, multiple statues of pharaohs in the traditional Egyptian style, a head that may represent Mark Antony. They found inscriptions. They found dozens of granite blocks, some of them clearly architectural elements from major structures, and they found anchors, many anchors. The anchors are significant because they indicate where ships were moored and where naval activity was concentrated, and they allow archaeologists to begin to map the organisation of the ancient harbour. Different types of anchors correspond to different periods: stone anchors from the Bronze Age, lead-stocked anchors from the Hellenistic period, iron anchors from the Roman era, and the distribution of anchor types gives a picture of how the harbour's use evolved over time. The physical remains of actual warships are harder to find and identify. Warships were expensive, carefully maintained, and when they were retired from service they were typically dismantled rather than simply abandoned. Their valuable bronze fittings, timber and rigging recovered for reuse. A warship that sank in battle might leave traces. Bronze rams, which were heavy and often lost when the ship went down, are among the most distinctive archaeological markers of ancient naval combat. But the wooden hull would typically be consumed by the Teredo worm over decades, leaving at best a scatter of iron and bronze fittings, ballast stones, and amphora sherds in the sediment. At Actium itself, the bay on the western coast of Greece where the great battle was fought, underwater archaeological surveys have been conducted since the 1980s, and a small number of bronze rams have been found in the bay. The rams are the closest thing we have to physical evidence of the battle, and they are remarkable objects. Cast in bronze, designed in the shape of a triple-bladed projection that could pierce a ship's hull, they are heavy and dense and surprisingly beautiful. The artistry of their casting speaks to the care that went into their manufacture, even though their purpose was destruction. 2 rams confirmed to be from ancient warships have been recovered from the waters near Actium, and each one is a direct, tangible connection to the events of September 2nd, 31 BC. Lake Mareotis, the great lake that formed the southern boundary of ancient Alexandria, was in Cleopatra's time one of the most important bodies of water in Egypt after the Nile itself. The lake connected to the Nile through a series of canals, and it gave Alexandria its southern harbour, through which vast quantities of Egyptian produce flowed toward the Mediterranean, and thence to the wider world. The lake was also, apparently, the site of some of the Ptolemaic royal estates, private islands and pleasure palaces accessible only by boat, where the royal family retreated from the heat and business of the city. Over the centuries after the Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century AD, Lake Mareotis shrank dramatically. The canals that had connected it to the Nile silted up and were not maintained, and the lake's water level dropped. Agricultural reclamation gradually converted its marshy shores to farmland. By the 19th century, the lake was a shadow of its ancient self, and today it is a heavily polluted body of water, edged by industrial development, its ancient history hidden beneath accumulated sediment and the changes of 2,000 years. But the lake's shrinkage preserved something. As the water level dropped over centuries, the sites that had been on or near the ancient shoreline became accessible for archaeology, in a way that fully submerged sites are not. And beneath the sediments of the former lakeshore, archaeologists have found traces of structures that may correspond to the royal estates described in ancient sources, the same estates where Cleopatra walked and planned and looked out over the water toward her city. In the waters of the eastern harbour itself, Godio's team made one of the most emotionally resonant discoveries of the entire Alexandria project, the remains of what they believe to be the island of Antiochodos, which ancient sources identify as the site of a Ptolemaic royal palace complex. This is the palace where Cleopatra may have lived, where Caesar stayed during his visit, where Antony spent his Alexandrian winters. It is now approximately 6 to 8 meters beneath the surface of the harbour, its paving stones scattered by the millennia, but its general outline still visible in the sonar surveys. Among the objects found near this site was a granite sphinx that bears features which may represent Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII. There were colossal statues of priests and deities. There were blocks inscribed with hieroglyphs, and there were, scattered across the harbour floor around the site, the remains of columns and architectural elements that suggest a building of considerable scale and sophistication. This is where she lived. Perhaps not in those exact rooms, because the palace complex was large and her personal apartments are not precisely locatable from the archaeological evidence, but in this place, in this water, in this city, and the sea has kept it, after a fashion, not intact, not whole, not the way she saw it, but present, still present, in fragments and shadows beneath the water that she sailed upon, beneath the harbour where her ships came home. The Cleopatra that history gave us, the seductress, the schemer, the exotic foreign queen who destroyed 2 great Roman men through the power of her sexuality, is Octavian's Cleopatra. It is the image created by the most effective propaganda machine the ancient world ever produced, deployed by a man who understood better than anyone the importance of controlling the story. Octavian, who became Augustus Caesar, needed Cleopatra to be a villain because he needed the war against her to have been a righteous war. If Antony had simply been seduced by a clever, powerful woman who had manipulated him away from his Roman values, then Octavian was the defender of those values, the man who had saved Rome from a dangerous foreign influence. If, on the other hand, the war had been a straightforward Roman power struggle between 2 men who both wanted to be emperor, then Octavian was simply the survivor of a civil war, which was historically true but politically inconvenient. The Roman literary tradition that followed Augustus, the poets Virgil and Horace, the historian Livy, and later writers like Plutarch and Dio Cassius, inherited this framing and reproduced it with varying degrees of critical awareness. Horace wrote of Cleopatra as a fatal monstrum, a deadly monster, who had sought to destroy Rome and celebrated her defeat as a kind of divine intervention. Virgil's Aeneid, the great founding epic of Roman identity written at Augustus's encouragement, depicts Antony and Cleopatra together at the Battle of Actium in imagery that makes Cleopatra's presence among the Roman forces a kind of pollution, a corruption. Her Egyptian gods ranged against Rome's ordered Olympians. But the tradition was not monolithic. Even within ancient Rome, there were writers who saw Cleopatra differently, or who allowed glimpses of a different woman to show through their otherwise hostile accounts. Plutarch, who is our most detailed ancient source for Cleopatra's life, and who wrote from a Greek perspective rather than a Roman one, gives us moments of real humanity. The Charmian scene at her death, the description of her linguistic gifts, the account of her charm in conversation that he emphasized was about wit and intelligence rather than physical beauty alone. And there are the Egyptian sources which are almost entirely lost but which we know existed. The temple at Dendera in Upper Egypt has a relief carving of Cleopatra that is one of the very few images of her from Egyptian rather than Roman tradition. She appears in it as a pharaoh, in the conventional Egyptian style, performing the religious rituals of a divine ruler. There is no coquetry, no Eastern exoticism, no suggestion of the seductress. There is a Queen of Egypt standing in the full dignity of that ancient office, exactly as she would have wanted to be remembered by her own people. The afterlife of Cleopatra in Western culture is a story of continuous reinvention, each era remaking her in its own image while preserving the basic Roman framework of her story. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, written around 1606, is one of the greatest plays in the English language, and it does something remarkable. It takes the Roman characterization of Cleopatra as dangerous, excess, irrationality, all the things Rome associated with the East, and turns it into magnificence. Shakespeare's Cleopatra is manipulative, changeable, infuriating, and utterly compelling. She is infinite variety. The play knows that the Roman critique of her is also a kind of tribute. George Bernard Shaw's Caesar and Cleopatra, written at the very end of the 19th century, imagines her as a teenager being tutored in statecraft by the older Caesar, a revisionist reading that was partly Shaw's characteristic deflation of romantic myth, and partly a reflection of his own era's tendency to infantilize powerful women. The great Hollywood versions, Claudette Colbert's Cleopatra of 1934, Elizabeth Taylor's of 1963, are products of their own times, more revealing about how those eras thought about women and power and the ancient world than about Cleopatra herself. The more interesting modern versions are the scholarly ones, the biographies by Michael Grant, by Lucy Hughes Hallett, by Dwayne Roller, by Adrian Goldsworthy, by Stacy Schiff, whose 2010 biography, Cleopatra, A Life, is probably the most widely read modern account, and which makes a sustained, eloquent argument for taking Cleopatra seriously as a political actor and administrator rather than reducing her to her relationships with powerful men. What these scholars have collectively done is to begin the long process of prying Cleopatra out of the Augustan framing and looking at her again, more carefully, with more awareness of how the evidence we have was shaped by the people who created it, and what they have found underneath the myth is something more interesting than the myth. A woman of extraordinary intelligence and education who ruled one of the world's most complex societies for over 2 decades, who mastered multiple languages and navigated the most treacherous political landscape in the ancient world, who financed and commanded a navy, who conceived and nearly executed a plan to escape Roman dominance entirely, and who chose her own death rather than accept the role of spectacle in another man's triumph. She was not destroyed by love, she was destroyed by a superior military force, by the bad luck of weather at Actium, by the defection of allies who calculated their own interests, and by the political genius of an opponent who was every bit as cold and calculating as she was. She fought until she could not fight any more, and then she made the only choice that was left to her that still belonged to her. The work at Alexandria is ongoing. Frank Godio's team has been surveying and excavating the submerged city for over 3 decades, and each season brings new discoveries. The scale of what remains beneath the harbour is difficult to comprehend. The site covers several square kilometres and contains material from the Ptolemaic period, the Roman period, the Byzantine period, and the early Islamic period, all layered together in the complex stratigraphy of a harbour floor that was in continuous use for over 1,000 years. In recent years, the excavations have begun to focus more specifically on the Royal Harbour area, the Neorion, the naval base where Cleopatra's fleet was maintained. The site has yielded a range of military and naval artefacts, iron anchors of the kind used by Hellenistic warships, lead sheathing that would have been applied to the hulls of large vessels, bronze fittings that may have come from ship's rails or structural elements, and a variety of tools and implements associated with ship construction and repair. No complete warship from the Ptolemaic period has been found in Alexandria's harbour, which is not surprising given what we know about the likelihood of ancient wooden ships surviving in Mediterranean waters. But wooden hull timbers have been found at other ancient Mediterranean sites in conditions where the wood was preserved by anaerobic sediment. The ancient Bronze Age shipwreck at Uluburun off the coast of Turkey, found in 1982, is among the oldest wooden ships ever recovered, dating to around 1300 BC and preserved in remarkable condition by the deep, cold, oxygen-poor water. In Alexandria's shallower harbour, such preservation is less likely, but not impossible. The hunt for the Actium rams continues in the Bay of Preveza, as the area around ancient Actium is now known. Each survey season adds to the catalogue of artefacts found in the bay, and the combination of sonar mapping and careful diver surveys is slowly building a picture of where the battle was fought and where the ships went down. Bronze rams are the most distinctive marker of ancient warship activity. They're heavy, they survive well in salt water, and they were attached to the prow in a way that often caused them to detach and sink when a ship was sunk or when the prow was damaged. The Athlete ram, recovered from the seabed off the coast of Israel in 1980, and now in the National Maritime Museum in Haifa, is among the finest examples of a complete ancient naval ram ever found. It dates to the late 3rd or early 2nd century BC, roughly contemporary with the height of Ptolemaic naval power, and its detail is extraordinary. The triple blades, the reinforcing bars, the casting marks, the remains of the timber of the ship's bow to which it was attached, preserved inside the bronze by the same water that destroyed everything around it. Looking at the Athlete ram, you're looking at an object that is physically similar to the rams that Cleopatra's ships carried. The same technology, the same design, the same purpose. It is a strange and moving thing to hold an ancient object in your mind and know that its twin was once plunging through the grey water of the Ionian Sea on the morning of September 2nd, 31 BC, part of a fleet that carried the last hopes of the last pharaoh of Egypt. There is a phrase in Greek that was the name of the western harbour of Alexandria, the Eunostos, the harbour of safe return. It was named, presumably, for the wishful thinking of sailors who hoped that whatever seas they sailed on, however far they went, they would find their way back to this particular harbour. It is a beautiful name, and it carries a kind of melancholy when you know what eventually happened to the city. Alexandria shrank. It did not die. It is still there, the second city of modern Egypt, a sprawling Mediterranean port of roughly 5 million people, busy and noisy, and much changed from the ancient city beneath its streets and harbour. But the ancient Alexandria is mostly gone to time, gone to the sea, gone to the centuries of rebuilding that used the stones of old temples and palaces for new mosques and fortresses. The library is gone, the Museion is gone, the lighthouse is gone. The Ptolemaic palaces are beneath the water, but the harbour is still there, and ships still sail from it, and the Mediterranean is still the Mediterranean, still blue in summer, still grey in autumn, still shaped by the same winds that Cleopatra's sailors prayed to and feared. The geography that made Alexandria what it was still exists, the narrow strip of land between sea and lake, the slight curve of the bay, the place where the Heptastadion causeway once stood, now silted and built over and transformed into the peninsula of the modern city. Stand on the modern corniche in Alexandria on a clear autumn day and look north across the harbour, and you are looking at the same water that Cleopatra looked at. The lighthouse is gone, the palaces are gone, the fleet is gone. But the sea is there, unchanged in any fundamental way, carrying light the way it always has, keeping its secrets the way it always has, and somewhere below the surface, in the murk and the silt and the accumulated centuries, the fragments of a world that no longer exists are still, very slowly coming back to the light. The Battle of Actium did not just end a war, it ended an era. It ended the 300-year Hellenistic period, the age of Alexander's successors, the age of Greek-speaking kingdoms stretching from the Aegean to India, the age in which the Mediterranean world had been a complex pluralistic space of competing powers and cultures. After Actium, there was Rome, just Rome, pulling everything into its single enormous orbit, standardizing and organizing and taxing and governing with an efficiency that the Hellenistic world had never managed. Egypt's contribution to what came after was, in a peculiar way, enormous. The province of Egypt under Roman rule was the engine that powered the early empire. Its grain fed the city of Rome. Its papyrus was the medium on which the Roman administrative machine ran. Its trade connections with Arabia and India brought luxury goods that fueled the appetite for commerce. The wealth that Cleopatra had managed was now Octavian's wealth, and it financed the Augustan age of Roman culture, the building programs, the patronage of literature and art, the transformation of Rome from a city of brick into a city of marble that Augustus reportedly boasted of achieving. The last fleet of ancient Egypt also changed naval warfare in a sense, though this is harder to trace directly. The Battle of Actium demonstrated decisively the superiority of lighter, faster, more agile ships over the massive polyremes that the Hellenistic navies had preferred. Agrippa's smaller vessels, with their grappling weapons and their experienced crews, had beaten Antony and Cleopatra's heavier ships, not by matching them in size, but by exploiting their limitations, their slower turning speed, their greater difficulty in manoeuvring in close quarters, their vulnerability when their ore banks were damaged. The Roman navy that emerged from the post-Actium world was built on the lessons of that battle, and it favoured lighter, more responsive vessels for the next several centuries. Cleopatra's navy was the last of its kind. The great Ptolemaic tradition of building enormous polyremes, the tradition that had produced the legendary 40-banked ships of Ptolemy II, the tradition of Alexandria's vast royal dockyards turning out warships for 3 centuries, died with her. The ships that her successors built, under Roman supervision and for Roman purposes, were different ships, smaller, standardized, Roman in their conception and their purpose. The Egyptian naval tradition, that particular blend of Greek military engineering and Egyptian maritime knowledge and Ptolemaic ambition, simply ceased. Cleopatra's story also sits within a larger, often untold history of women who exercised real power in the ancient world, power that has been systematically minimized or distorted by later traditions shaped primarily by men. She was not the only powerful woman of her era. Arsinoe II, her ancestor from 2 centuries before, had been co-regent of Egypt and a significant military commander. Berenice IV, her older sister, briefly ruled Egypt. Olympias, Alexander the Great's mother, had wielded enormous political power. But Cleopatra exercised power at a larger scale, for a longer period, in a more complex political environment than any of them. The women who appear in her story in supporting roles, Eros and Charmian, her attendants who died with her, the unnamed women who struggled to pull Antony up through the mausoleum window, Octavia, Antony's Roman wife, who raised Cleopatra's children with a generosity that the ancient sources themselves remark on, are glimpses of a world in which women's agency was real and active even when it was not recorded. The history of the ancient world that we have is the history that powerful men chose to preserve, and the gaps in that history are not empty space. They are full of people who have simply not been given names. Cleopatra was given a name. She was given many names. In fact, her full Egyptian titulature was elaborate and magnificent, stretching back in its form to the pharaohs of the New Kingdom 1,000 years before her. She was called Philopator, lover of her father. She was called the New Isis, identifying herself with the great mother goddess of Egypt. She was called, on the walls of temples, the Brilliant One, the Beautiful One, the Lady of the Two Lands. These names are still there, carved in stone, in temples that survived the Roman conquest and the Byzantine era, and the Arab conquest and the Ottoman period, and the 19th century scramble for Egyptian antiquities and 2 world wars. You can go and read them. The woman who owned these names was not the temptress of Shakespeare or the tragic beauty of Hollywood. She was a working head of state who spoke 9 languages and commanded a navy, and managed the most complex economy in the ancient Mediterranean, and raised 4 children and tried for 22 years to keep her country free. She failed in the end because the forces against her were too large and her allies too few, and the world too unforgiving of anyone who loses a war. But she failed on her own terms, which is more than most people manage. If you go to Alexandria today, and you should, if the chance ever comes to you, because it is a city unlike any other in the world, You can stand at the site of the ancient lighthouse and look at the fort that was built with its stones. The citadel of Kite Bay is a beautiful building in its own right, a medieval fortress of honey-coloured stone that occupies the same promontory where the lighthouse once stood. The sea around it is the same sea, and on a clear day you can see the curve of the bay and understand immediately why this was always the right place to build a lighthouse. You can see far, and ships far out can see you. Beneath the water around the citadel, divers have found enormous blocks of stone that are too large and too finely worked to be anything other than pieces of the lighthouse itself mixed in with the remains of even older structures that predate the Ptolemaic period. The ancient world is literally beneath the surface here, mixed into the sediment of the harbour floor with medieval anchors and amphoras and the rusted machinery of the 20th century, all of it together in the indiscriminate way that time accumulates things. The corniche of modern Alexandria, the long seaside promenade that stretches for kilometres along the city's Mediterranean waterfront, follows roughly the line of the ancient city's northern edge. The buildings along it are a mixture of late 19th century European-style apartment blocks, mid-20th century concrete, and the occasional more recent development, and behind them the city extends south in a dense, busy, thoroughly modern Egyptian metropolis. But the geography is the same. The sea is on the same side. The wind comes from the same directions. The underwater archaeological park that Godiot and his collaborators have proposed for the eastern harbour, a system of marked dive trails allowing visitors to swim above the submerged ruins of the ancient city, has been discussed for decades without being fully realised, partly because of the difficulty of protecting an underwater site while also making it accessible, and partly because of the political and administrative complexities of managing such a project in the harbour of a busy modern city. But the conversation continues, the ambition is alive, and the ruins are there, waiting, with the patience of things that have been waiting for 2,000 years and can afford to wait a little longer. There is something that all the scholarship, all the archaeology, all the careful historical reconstruction cannot fully account for, and that is the quality of persistence that attaches to Cleopatra's name. Other Ptolemaic rulers, Ptolemy III, Euergetes, Berenice III, Arsinoe III, were significant figures in their time and are now known only to specialists. Cleopatra is known to everyone. She has been known continuously since her death, in an unbroken chain of stories, paintings, plays, poems, novels, operas, films, and now documentaries and podcasts and YouTube videos that extends across 2,000 years without a break. Why? Partly, it is the Roman propaganda which, in trying to make her monstrous, made her memorable. Partly, it is the quality of the story itself. Two great loves, a kingdom lost, a death chosen rather than endured. These are the elements of tragedy in its most fundamental sense. The sense of someone great brought low by forces too large to overcome. Partly it is the sheer dramatic texture of the world she inhabited, with its palaces and fleets and libraries and the weight of ancient Egypt's 3,000 years of civilization, pressing down on the narrow, brilliant, dangerous life of a single woman. And partly, perhaps, it is something harder to define, a quality in her that the historical record, hostile as much of it is, cannot quite suppress. An impression of someone who was genuinely, unmistakably awake, present to the world in a way that most people, even most rulers, never are, who paid attention, who thought hard about everything, who refused, even in defeat, even at the very end, to be diminished. The sea doesn't remember in the way that we do. It doesn't keep stories. It keeps objects, the anchors, the rams, the amphoras, and it keeps the geography, the shape of the bay where the lighthouse burned, the curve of the harbour where the fleet assembled. But the stories we tell about it, the meaning we give to the objects and the geography, those we keep for ourselves. We keep them because they are about things that still matter, power and its limits, ambition and its costs, the difference between what we build and what survives, the strange persistence of names across the centuries. Cleopatra's navy is gone. The ships are gone. The crews are gone. The dockyards are beneath the sea and beneath the city and beneath the patient accumulation of time. But the harbour is there, the sea is there, and the story, told again and again in different voices with different emphases, continues to find its way to people who lie awake in the dark, listening, following a fleet they have never seen across a sea. They have never sailed toward a battle that happened 2,000 years ago and still, somehow, feels unfinished. We have talked about the fleet in the abstract, as a strategic asset, as a political symbol, as a chapter in the story of power. But let's slow down for a moment and look more closely at the ships themselves, because they were extraordinary objects, and the people who built them and sailed them deserve more than a passing mention. They deserve to be seen, as closely as the historical and archaeological record allows us to see them, as the real and remarkable things they were. The great warships of the Ptolemaic fleet, the quinqueremes and hexaremes that formed the core of Cleopatra's fighting force, were built in the royal dockyards of Alexandria over periods of months or even years. The process began long before any timber was shaped. It began in the forests, where agents of the royal administration identified suitable trees, negotiated with the local authorities or landowners who controlled the timber rights, and arranged for the felling, transport, and preliminary processing of the wood. Cedar from Lebanon was the prestige timber, the same cedar that had built Solomon's temple in Jerusalem and the great Phoenician trading ships of the Bronze Age, a wood prized for its straight grain, its resistance to rot, its lightness relative to its strength, and the fragrant preservative oils that kept moisture from penetrating it too deeply. The cedar logs were floated down rivers when possible, or loaded onto merchant ships and transported by sea to Alexandria's harbour. There they were unloaded, into the timber yards of the dockyards and stacked in ways that allowed air to circulate around them, the seasoning process that removed moisture from the wood and reduced its tendency to warp and crack during construction. The time required for proper seasoning depended on the thickness of the timber, but for the large pieces needed in major warship construction, keel timbers, frames, the massive curved stem and sternpost pieces, 2 to 5 years of seasoning was considered proper. The Ptolemaic dockyards maintained these timber stocks continuously, replenishing them as wood was used, and adding to them when political and financial conditions allowed. The men who did the actual building, the shipwrights, were skilled craftsmen operating in a tradition that stretched back centuries. The craft was passed from father to son, from master to apprentice, and the knowledge embedded in it was practical and embodied rather than theoretical, knowing how to read the grain of the plank to predict how it would behave when bent to the curve of the hull, knowing how to cut a mortise and tenon joint with the precision required for structural integrity, knowing how to judge whether a piece of timber was properly seasoned or still too green. This knowledge was not written down in any systematic way. There are no ancient shipbuilding manuals, no illustrated guides to Hellenistic naval construction. What we know about how these ships were built comes from the physical evidence of ancient wrecks and from the scattered references in literary and documentary sources pieced together over decades of scholarship. The mortise and tenon joinery that held the planks of the hull together was extraordinarily precise. Each joint consisted of a rectangular slot, the mortise, cut into the edge of one plank, and a corresponding projection, the tenon, cut from the adjacent plank. The joint was then locked in place with a wooden peg, the tree nail, driven through both plank and tenon. The result in a well-built ship was a hull of remarkable tightness. Modern experimental reconstructions of ancient warships have found that properly built, shell-first hulls with mortise and tenon joinery are surprisingly watertight even without any caulking, because the joints swell when wet and become effectively sealed. The internal framing, the ribs and frames that were inserted after the shell was complete, added further structural rigidity and provided attachment points for the horizontal timbers that supported the rowing platforms. A warship of Cleopatra's period would have had 3 levels of rowing benches, the thronites at the uppermost level, the zigites in the middle, and the thalamites closest to the waterline, the most uncomfortable position both because it was lowest and darkest. and because the oar ports through which the lower rowers worked their oars had to be kept close to the waterline, meaning that in rough conditions water frequently came in through them. The Ptolemaic oar ports were fitted with leather sleeves, oarsmen's bags they were called, that allowed the oar shaft to move while preventing water from pouring through when the ship rolled. The oars themselves were another engineering achievement. They had to be exactly the right length for their level of the ship. The Thranites' oars were longer than the Zygites, which were longer than the Ptolemites, because each level sat at a different height above the waterline, and the oar had to reach the water at the same angle regardless of which level it was on. They also had to be balanced so that the rower could pull effectively without fighting the weight of the oar itself. The ancient sources tell us that oars were made from fir, which was light and flexible enough to absorb the shock of a hard stroke without shattering. They were finished smooth and sometimes lightly greased to slide easily through the oar ports. A full set of oars for a kenkarame, perhaps 300 oars of varying lengths, represented a significant investment of material and skilled labour and was treated accordingly. Oars were stored in the arsenals when the ships were not in use, counted and inspected regularly, and repaired or replaced as needed. The sails, those crucial sails that Cleopatra's fleet carried at Actium, were large rectangular pieces of linen, or sometimes papyrus fabric, attached to a single main yard that was raised and lowered along the mast. Ancient sailing rigs were relatively simple compared to the complex multi-sail arrangements of later centuries, and were fundamentally designed for sailing before the wind or at moderate angles to it. Sailing into the wind was extremely difficult and largely impossible in the direct sense. Ancient ships tacked before the wind rather than beating into it, and their ability to make progress against a contrary wind was limited. This is why the seasonal patterns of Mediterranean winds were so important to ancient navigation. Sailors planned their voyages around the winds they could expect at particular times of year, timing departures and arrivals to take advantage of favourable conditions. The rigging that controlled the sail, the halyards that raised and lowered the yard, the braces that swung the yard to catch the wind from different angles, the lines called sheets that controlled the lower corners of the sail, was made of rope, and the rope was made from hemp, flax, or esparto grass, depending on the application. The most important ropes, the stays that held the mast upright and prevented it from falling when the ship pitched in heavy seas, were made of the best available material and replaced regularly, because a broken stay could bring down the mast and render a ship helpless. The care that went into maintaining rigging was as important as the care that went into maintaining the hull, and the arsenals of Alexandria's dockyards held not just oars and weapons but enormous quantities of rope and canvas, stored and maintained against the constant attrition of use and weather. A quinquereme needed approximately 300 rowers to operate, and a fleet of 230 such ships would have required something on the order of 70,000 rowers, a figure so large that it gives pause. Where did Cleopatra find 70,000 men willing or able to row warships? The answer is that not all the ships were quinqueremes, some were smaller, and that the crew numbers include not just rowers but marines, officers and support personnel. But the basic logistical challenge remains enormous, and understanding it helps explain why maintaining a large navy was so expensive, and why fleet strength was always more limited in practice than it might seem on paper. The rowers came from the broad population of Egypt and the wider Ptolemaic world. Some were professional sailors who had served in previous campaigns and returned to service when the fleet was mobilized. Some were recruited specifically for this campaign from the coastal and river communities of Egypt, where men with rowing experience were relatively abundant. The Nile was a river of boats, and Egyptians had been working rivers and canals from small vessels since the earliest periods of their history. Some, undoubtedly, were people who had little real choice about whether to serve. The poor, the indebted, the clients and dependents of large landowners who were themselves obligated to supply men to the crown when the crown demanded them. Rowing a warship in battle was among the most demanding physical activities in the ancient world. A trained rower could pull at maximum effort, the combat stroke, all power and no conservation, for only a few minutes before exhaustion began to degrade the precision of the movement and precision mattered because rowing a large ship required every oarsman to pull in exactly the right rhythm, at exactly the right angle, with exactly the right force. Rower who was off rhythm didn't just waste his own energy, he disrupted the stroke of everyone around him, creating turbulence in the water that reduced the ship's speed and manoeuvrability at the moment when both were most critical. Training was therefore not just about building physical strength, but about building the kind of deeply ingrained muscle memory that could function under stress. Rowing crews practiced together for weeks and months, learning to respond instinctively to the Celestes' signals, to maintain rhythm even when the ship was rolling in choppy water or heeling under the force of a sharp turn. The best crews were those that had been together long enough to become almost a single organism, their individual efforts seamlessly coordinated into the smooth, powerful, eerily regular motion that drove a warship through the water at its maximum speed. At maximum effort, an ancient warship could reach speeds of perhaps 8 to 10 knots for short bursts, remarkable for a vessel of its size and weight, and fast enough to make ramming a viable tactic. The ram attack required the attacking ship to achieve and maintain this speed for the few seconds of approach before impact, while the defending ship tried to turn away or back water to reduce the force of the blow. The split-second timing required for a successful ram attack, and the equally split-second awareness required to avoid one made experienced rowers and quick-responding ships invaluable assets, worth far more than their number alone would suggest. After the battle, assuming the ship was still afloat and the crew still alive, the rowers faced a different kind of ordeal, the physical aftermath of hours of combat rowing, which left muscles trembling and hands raw and backs aching in ways that persisted for days. They would eat bread, olives, dried fish, onions, the monotonous rations of the ancient sailor, and they would sleep, often on the beach or on the ship's deck, because these ships were not designed for accommodation at sea. The life of a warship's crew was one of alternating extremes, long periods of tedious coastal sailing and waiting, punctuated by brief, exhausting, terrifying episodes of combat. The men who lived this life and kept going back to it were not ordinary people, whatever their legal status or their position in the social hierarchy of the ancient world. Above the rowers, in the hierarchy of a Ptolemaic warship, were a series of officers whose duties were specialized and whose positions carried real authority. The triarch, the captain of the ship, was responsible for the vessel's overall operation, its maintenance, its discipline, and its tactical performance in battle. In the Greek naval tradition from which the Ptolemaic navy descended, the triarch was typically a wealthy man who had been assigned the ship as a public duty, a liturgy, and who was expected to supplement the state's funding of the ship from his own resources. By Cleopatra's time, this system had evolved somewhat, and the triarchs of the Ptolemaic fleet were more professional naval officers than wealthy civilians performing a civic obligation. But the position retained its character as one of significant personal responsibility and social prestige. The Kybernetes, the helmsman, was in many ways the most technically skilled officer on the ship. He controlled the twin steering oars that served the function of a rudder, managing the ship's direction and responding to the captain's tactical decisions by translating them into adjustments of heading and speed. The helmsman's position was at the stern, elevated enough to give a view over the rowers' heads to the water ahead, and he worked in close coordination with the Celestes, the stroke caller, to ensure that the rowers' pace matched the tactical requirements of the moment. A helmsman who could hold a tight, precise course through the chaos of a naval battle, maintaining position, relative to friendly ships, threading between enemies, responding instantly to changes in wind and current, was worth many times his weight in gold, and such men were known, valued, and competed for. The prorates, the bow officer, had responsibility for the forward section of the ship, including the management of the ram attack. He watched the approaching enemy, judged the distances and angles, and gave the signal for the final sprint that carried the ram home. He was also responsible for the management of anchors and the ship's forward mooring equipment, and in harbour operations his role was crucial for the precise positioning of the large unwieldy vessels. Marines, armed soldiers who fought from the ship's deck, were a crucial component of the crew, but existed in a somewhat uneasy relationship with the sailors. They were land fighters, trained for close combat and boarding, and they tended to have different attitudes, different skills, and different loyalties than the sailors and rowers. In the Roman fleet, the Marines were typically legionaries assigned to naval duty, proper soldiers with all the training and discipline that implied. In Cleopatra's Egyptian fleet, they were a mixture of Egyptian soldiers, Greek mercenaries, and men from various parts of the Ptolemaic world, their equipment and training varying accordingly. The relationship between all these different groups of men, the rowers, the sailors, the marines, the officers, was the living reality of the fleet, as distinct from the strategic and diplomatic abstraction that historical accounts tend to present. These were men who lived together in cramped conditions, who depended on each other absolutely for survival, who had their own internal hierarchies and grudges and loyalties and jokes. When the Battle of Actium was over and the surviving ships scattered, these men had to find their way in a world that had just been completely reorganized. Most of them, almost certainly, simply went home, or to whatever passed for home in the lives of people who had spent months at sea in service of a queen who was now dead. They went back to their families, their villages, their trades. They told the story of what they had seen, and then, gradually they died, and the story died with them, leaving only the distant literary echoes and the bronze rams on the harbour floor. To understand what was truly lost at Actium, beyond the ships, beyond the fleet, beyond the particular lives of Cleopatra and Antony, you have to understand what the Hellenistic world was and what kind of world replaced it. Because the transition from the era of the Ptolemies to the era of Roman imperial rule was not just a change of government, it was a change in the fundamental character of Mediterranean civilization, a shift that shaped everything that came after it, including, in ways that are still unfolding, the world we live in today. The Hellenistic world, the world that Alexander's conquest created, and that the Ptolemies were among the last custodians of, was a world of extraordinary cultural and intellectual vitality. It was a world in which Greek language and Greek cultural forms had spread across an enormous geographic area, from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the borders of India, but in which that Greek culture was not a monolith imposed over everything else. It was a world of hybridization, of creative mixture, of traditions blending and producing new forms that were neither purely Greek nor purely whatever the local culture had been before. In Egypt, this produced a civilization that was genuinely remarkable. A fusion of 3,000-year-old Egyptian religious and cultural traditions with the philosophical rigour of Greek thought and the cosmopolitan energy of a city like Alexandria, which drew talent and ideas from every corner of the known world. The library and the Mouseion were the most visible expressions of this fusion, but it showed up everywhere. In the Ptolemaic religious program, which combined Egyptian and Greek deities in innovative ways, in the art of the period, which blended Egyptian iconography with Greek naturalism, in the administrative system, which combined Greek bureaucratic methods with Egyptian organisational traditions that went back to the Old Kingdom. The Roman world that replaced this was, in many ways, more powerful and more coherent. Rome's administrative genius, its ability to govern enormous territories through a system of law, infrastructure, and local self-government that was broadly applicable across very different cultural contexts, was something the Hellenistic kingdoms had never achieved. The Pax Romana, the long period of relative peace and stability that Augustus inaugurated, and that lasted for roughly 2 centuries, was a genuine achievement that benefited the lives of millions of people who never had to worry about their city being besieged or their farm being burned in a dynastic war. But something was also lost. The pluralism of the Hellenistic world, the way in which different traditions and approaches could coexist, compete, and cross-fertilize within a broadly shared cultural framework, was gradually replaced by the more standardizing impulse of the Roman system. Local cultures survived, but they survived in the interstices of Roman power rather than at its centre. The great intellectual traditions of Alexandria continued for centuries under Roman rule, but they continued in a context that was subtly different, more provincial, more removed from the centres of political and economic power, more aware of itself as the relic of something rather than the living expression of it. The Mausoleum and the library survived the Roman conquest, and they continued to function as centres of scholarship for centuries. The great mathematician Ptolemy, no relation to the Ptolemaic dynasty, just a man with a very common name in the ancient world, worked in Alexandria in the 2nd century AD and produced his Almagest, the definitive astronomical text of antiquity, and his geography, which shaped how the Western world understood the shape of the earth for over 1,000 years. The physician Galen, the philosopher Plotinus, the mathematician Diophantus, all worked in or were influenced by the Alexandrian tradition in the Roman period. The city was diminished from what it had been, but it was not dead. The library's actual end is one of the great scholarly debates of antiquity, precisely because there was no single dramatic moment of destruction to point to. There was the fire in Caesar's time that may or may not have destroyed part of the collection. There were periodic political upheavals, there were budget cuts and institutional decline, and eventually there was simply the slow erosion of support and interest that ends most institutions. By the time of the Arab conquest of Egypt in 641 AD, there may not have been much left to destroy. The Arabic sources that describe Arab general Amr ibn al-As receiving an inquiry from Caliph Umar about what to do with the library, and Umar responding that if the books agreed with the Quran they were unnecessary, and if they disagreed they were heretical. This story, often cited as the definitive account of the library's destruction, was almost certainly written centuries after the events it describes and is very likely legendary. The truth, as usual, was probably more mundane and more sad. The library faded away gradually, its collections dispersed or deteriorated, its institutional support withdrawn by a series of rulers who had other priorities. There is a location in the eastern harbour of Alexandria that deserves one more extended visit before we leave. The sunken island of Antihodos, which Godio's team identified in their surveys, and which ancient sources describe as the site of a royal palace complex. To understand what this place might have meant in Cleopatra's time, you have to understand the particular relationship that the Ptolemaic rulers had with the sea, not just as a strategic asset or a commercial resource, but as a kind of environment, a setting, a presence in their lives. The Ptolemaic royal family spent a great deal of time on and near water. The royal harbour, which was immediately adjacent to the palace complex, was not just a military installation, but a living space. Ships moved through it constantly, and the sounds of the harbour were the background noise of the royal court. The Heptastadion causeway was wide enough for wheeled traffic, and the king or queen could drive or walk from the main palace complex to the island of Pharos, from which the view of the open sea was unobstructed. The Thalamigos, the great Ptolemaic royal barge, a palatial floating structure described in ancient sources as having dining rooms, gardens, shrines, and audience chambers, was moored in the royal harbour and used for both ceremonial voyages and private pleasure. The island of Antihodos sat within this harbour, a small island connected to the palace complex by boat, apparently used as a private residence or retreat. To be on Antihodos was to be surrounded by water, the harbour on all sides, the ships moving in and out, the lighthouse visible to the north, the low Egyptian coast to the south and east. In the evenings, the light on the water would have been extraordinary. The particular golden light of the Egyptian Mediterranean that painters have been chasing for centuries, light that seems to come from below the surface as much as from above it. We do not know exactly what Cleopatra did in this place, in these evenings, in the years before everything collapsed. The ancient sources do not preserve that kind of intimate detail. But we know she was there, in this city, on this water, living a life of extraordinary complexity and responsibility, and, at least some of the time, extraordinary beauty. The library was nearby. The sounds of a city of 1 million people drifted across the water. The Mediterranean was out there beyond the lighthouse, full of ships, full of possibility, full of the world she was trying to manage and protect and hold on to. And then, in the summer of 30 BC, she was gone. The palace became Roman property. The ships were Roman ships. The lighthouse burned for the ships of a new empire. The island of Antirodos continued to subside slowly over the centuries until it slipped beneath the surface of the harbour and was forgotten. Godio's divers, swimming in the murky water of the eastern harbour in the 1990s and 2000s, found it again. Columns lying on the harbour floor, paving stones, fragments of statuary, an anchor, the things that outlast everything else, that resist the sea's dissolution longer than wood or fabric, or the names people are called by. The material world, in the end, keeps its records differently from the literary one. Not in stories, but in objects. Not in words, but in shapes. Not in meaning, but in sheer, stubborn physical persistence. One of Cleopatra's most significant achievements, one that is almost never discussed in accounts of her life that focus on the drama of her relationships and her military defeats, was the maintenance and expansion of Egypt's long-distance trade networks during her reign. In the years between, her restoration to the throne in 48 BC and the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, Cleopatra governed Egypt for nearly 2 decades, and she governed it with considerable administrative effectiveness. The trade between Egypt and the Indian Ocean world, Arabia, India, East Africa, was among the most economically significant in the ancient world, and it had been conducted through Egyptian ports on the Red Sea since at least the time of the New Kingdom. Ptolemaic rulers had worked to develop and expand these routes, building or improving ports at Berenice, Myos Hormuz, and other points on the Egyptian Red Sea coast, and maintaining the diplomatic relationships with Arabian and Indian rulers that allowed Egyptian merchants to operate safely in those waters. Under Cleopatra, these networks continued to function and, by some accounts, expanded. The goods that flowed through these routes shaped the material culture of the Mediterranean world. Pepper from India, so valuable in antiquity that it could literally be used as currency, came through Egyptian hands. So did cinnamon from Sri Lanka or East Africa, the exact source being a matter of confusion in ancient sources. Cotton cloth, ivory, tortoiseshell, and various precious stones came from India and East Africa. In the other direction, Mediterranean goods, wine, olive oil, fine glassware, metals, flowed into the Indian Ocean trade network. Egypt was the indispensable middleman, taking a cut of everything that passed through its territory, and that cut was a very significant proportion of what kept Alexandria wealthy. Cleopatra understood this, and she invested in infrastructure accordingly. In the harbours of the Red Sea coast, in the roads and canal systems that connected the Nile Valley to the Red Sea, in the administrative networks that collected customs duties and regulated the trade. This is why her plan to escape by sea to the east, after Actium, was not a fantasy but a calculated assessment of where Egypt's real economic power lay. The Mediterranean was lost. Rome controlled it. But the Indian Ocean, the Monsoon Sea, the Sea of Dows and Arabian sailors and Indian merchants was still open, still operating on systems that Rome did not yet control and could not easily reach. That door was closed by the Nabatean fire. But the trade itself continued under Roman rule, because no empire that controlled Egypt could afford to let it stop. Augustus himself was interested in the eastern trade, and early in his reign he sent a general named Aelius Gallus on an expedition to Arabia that was partly military and partly commercial, an attempt to get closer to the source of the luxury goods that were flowing through Egypt's hands. The expedition was not a great success militarily, but it showed that Rome had inherited, along with Egypt, Egypt's interest in and dependence on the long-distance trade routes that Cleopatra had maintained. The trade continued, the ships continued. Different owners, different flags, but the same routes, the same monsoon winds, the same exchange of goods between the Mediterranean world and the Indian Ocean world And in that continuity, in the persistence of the economic patterns that Egypt had developed over centuries, there is something that outlasted Cleopatra's navy and Cleopatra's fleet and Cleopatra's kingdom. The simple, durable fact of the sea as a road and the people who were willing to sail it. The rediscovery of ancient Alexandria, the literary rediscovery, through the patient work of classical scholars over many centuries, and the physical rediscovery, through the work of archaeologists in the 19th and 20th and 21st centuries, is its own story, and it is a story worth at least a brief telling, because it illustrates something important about how the past comes back to us. Ancient Alexandria was never entirely forgotten. The city continued to exist after its conquest by Rome, after the Arab conquest in 641 AD, after the Ottoman conquest in 1517. Throughout all of these changes of regime, Alexandria remained an important port city, and its ancient past was a physical presence in the streets. Ancient columns reused as building materials, ancient statues half buried in gardens, ancient inscriptions visible in the walls of later buildings. Medieval Arab geographers and scholars noted these remains, and sometimes attempted to identify them with the structures described in ancient sources. European scholarly interest in ancient Alexandria intensified dramatically after Napoleon's Egyptian expedition of 1798 to 1801, which brought a large team of scholars and artists as well as soldiers, and produced the monumental Description de l'Égypte, a multi-volume record of Egyptian history, geography, and natural history that introduced European readers to the full richness and complexity of what lay in Egypt. The expedition was militarily a failure. Napoleon's forces were eventually driven out by a combination of British naval power and Egyptian resistance, but it transformed European understanding of Egypt and sparked a century and more of intense archaeological and historical interest. The excavations of the 19th and early 20th centuries in Alexandria were often conducted with more enthusiasm than care by modern standards, and much was lost or inadequately recorded. But they also produced important finds, inscriptions that helped reconstruct the administrative history of the Ptolemaic period, architectural elements that helped identify the locations of ancient buildings, and the occasional spectacular object, a gilded statue, a magnificent cameo, a perfectly preserved Ptolemaic coin, that brought the ancient city vividly to life for a Victorian or Edwardian public that had grown up on Shakespeare's Cleopatra and was hungry for more. The underwater archaeology of the 20th and 21st centuries has been different in character, more systematic, more technologically sophisticated, more carefully documented, and conducted with a much greater awareness of the irreplaceable nature of what is being studied. The shift from simply excavating and removing objects to studying them in context, understanding not just what each object is, but where it was found, what it was found near, how it was oriented, what the sediment around it tells us about how it got there, has transformed what underwater archaeology can tell us about the ancient world. The work of Godio's team in Alexandria's harbour, and the parallel work of the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities in other parts of the site, has produced a body of knowledge about ancient Alexandria that would have been unimaginable 50 years ago. We now know, at least in broad outline, where the royal quarter was. We know roughly where the main palace complex stood. We know the location of at least some of the great ceremonial structures. We know, from the distribution of artefacts and architectural remains, something about how the harbour was organised and where different activities were concentrated. What we still do not know, what we may never know, is the texture of daily life in that place. What Cleopatra had for breakfast. What she was thinking when she stood at the harbour's edge and watched her ships being prepared for sea. Whether she was afraid in those last months, or whether the quality of her mind and her character allowed her to face what was coming with something closer to equanimity than fear. These things are lost, not in the harbour, but in the silence that is all that is left when everyone who knew has died. History gives us the structure of events. Archaeology gives us the physical setting, and the imagination, disciplined by what the evidence allows but still fundamentally imaginative, fills in something of the human reality that neither can provide alone. That is what stories do. That is what this story has been doing all this time. That is the story of Cleopatra's navy, the last fleet of ancient Egypt, built in the dockyards of Alexandria, sailed across the Ionian Sea and lost at Actium on a September morning more than 2,000 years ago. It is a story about ships, but it is also a story about the people who built them and crewed them and risked their lives on them, and about the one woman who, more than anyone else, understood that the sea was not just a threat to be defended against, but a road to be taken, a road to power, to freedom, to somewhere beyond the reach of the empire that wanted to swallow everything. She took that road as far as she could, and when she could go no further, she stopped on her own terms, in her own time, with her crown still on her head. If you found yourself here, at the end of this, having listened through all of it, through the dockyards and the battles and the sunken palaces and the bronze rams lying on the harbour floor, then thank you. Thank you for staying with the story. These long dives into the ancient world are made for people who want to be somewhere else for a while, who find that the past is a better country than the news, who like to fall asleep to the sound of history moving slowly through the dark. Drop a comment below and tell me what brought you here, and where you are and what time it is wherever you're listening from. I read every single one. If there's a figure or a period or a lost civilization you want to go looking for next, tell me. There are so many more of these stories and they are all waiting.